I want you to take a second and just look at a scar on your body.
Any scar at all.
Yeah, literally anything. Like, it could be a tiny paper cut on your finger, or a scraped knee from when you were a kid, or even like a surgical mark. Just look at it.
Right.
We usually see that, that lighter patch of skin, and we just think, well, that's where I got hurt, and now it's better.
Right, it's fixed.
Exactly. But have you ever stopped to consider what actually happened beneath the surface to make that mark? Like, what kind of chaotic, high-stakes biological calculation your body had to execute in the literal split second you took damage?
It's an unimaginably complex calculation, honestly.
Right.
Because your body is prioritizing survival above almost everything else.
Right.
And it is just constantly running that math in the background.
Which is the perfect entry point for today's deep dive into the pathophysiology of tissue repair and scarring.
Yes, it is.
Because we are pulling from a massive stack of sources today: historical medical journals, modern pathology textbooks, clinical trial postmortems, all of it. And the mission of this deep dive is to unpack the exact mechanisms of how your body actually heals.
And digging into these sources, one of the first things you realize is that, well, healing isn't just a single pathway.
No, it's really not.
Right. Every time you take damage, you essentially force your body into this massive fork in the road.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this, because pathologists actually split this whole overarching concept of repair into two distinct outcomes, right?
Exactly. They're mechanistically completely different. So you have regeneration on one side and fibrosis on the other.
Okay, so let's start with regeneration.
Right. So regeneration is basically the biological gold standard.
The ideal scenario.
Yeah, the absolute ideal. It happens when your body replaces lost cells with new cells of the exact same type. So it rebuilds the original architecture so flawlessly that, honestly, you can't even tell there was ever an injury.
Like if I get a superficial scrape on my arm or a tiny nick on my liver or something.
Exactly. In those cases, the tissue just quietly repaves itself with the original materials. True regeneration.
But then we have the other path, which is fibrosis.
Yes. Colloquially known as scarring.
Right.
So when an injury is just too severe, like a full-thickness laceration through the deep layers of the skin, or, surviving a massive heart attack, your body realizes it simply cannot regenerate the original tissue.
It just doesn't have the resources or the ability.
Right, so it shifts gears entirely. It decides to repair the structural deficit with connective tissue. It lays down this incredibly dense, collagen-rich patch just to plug the hole.
It just spackles over it.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in a technical, medical sense, both of these outcomes count as repair. But only regeneration actually restores function. Fibrosis, on the other hand, well, it simply stops you from falling apart.
Right. But, to really grasp how your body makes this choice between perfectly regenerating something and just like slapping a scar over it, we kind of have to look at how our whole understanding of biological damage evolved.
Oh, totally. We didn't always view a scar as a compromise.
No, not at all. And the modern understanding of this, looking at the history sources, it traces its roots back to the late 18th century, largely to this Scottish surgeon named John Hunter.
Right, in 1794.
Yeah, he published these really extensive observations on gunshot wounds and battlefield injuries. And you really have to picture the context here.
Oh, it was brutal.
Yeah, musket balls, incredibly dirty wounds, rampant infection everywhere. And prior to Hunter, all that intense swelling and redness and the heat around a wound, people viewed that as like mystical afflictions.
Or just the literal mechanical failure of the flesh, like it was just rotting away.
Exactly. Inflammation was the enemy, which, funny enough, is still kind of how we view it today, right? We ice our sprained ankles, we pop ibuprofen.
Right, we try to stop it.
But Hunter looked at these gruesome battlefield injuries and realized the heat and the swelling weren't the flesh rotting. It was a purposeful systemic reaction.
The body was actively turning on a piece of machinery.
Right.
And he was really among the first to reframe inflammation not as a disease itself, but as this essential biological process.
Which was huge.
Just massive leap. And then jumping forward to 1858, you had this German pathologist, Rudolf Virchow, who narrowed that lens dramatically.
He zoomed way in.
He really did.
Yeah.
He introduced the doctrine of cellular pathology, and he famously coined the phrase omnis cellula e cellula.
Which means every cell arises from a pre-existing cell.
Exactly. So he shifted the entire framework of disease and healing away from just gross anatomy down to microscopic cellular interactions.
And once we had that microscopic lens, this Italian histologist, Giulio Bizzozero, in 1894, he categorized the whole human body based on a tissue's fundamental ability to divide.
Right, he deduced that whether you regenerate or scar is heavily dictated by the specific roster of cells that happen to be living in the damaged area.
Yeah, and reading Bizzozero's classification in the textbooks for this deep dive, I kept visualizing it as this, like, workplace hierarchy.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. Because he argued that human cells fall into three categories. So
Yeah.
first, you have the labile cells, and I think of these as the relentless hustlers.
The ones that never stop.
Exactly. They are constantly working, constantly turning over and dividing. Your skin epidermis, the lining of your gut, your bone marrow, they just never take a break.
Right.
Then you have the stable or quiescent cells. These are like the on-call workers.
Right, they're dormant.
Yeah, they're dormant, just performing their specialized jobs. But if an injury happens, their biological pager goes off, and they can re-enter the cell cycle, divide, and replenish the tissue.
Right, like your liver cells or kidney tubule cells.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually an incredibly energy-efficient way to manage organs that don't face constant daily abrasion, but might occasionally suffer, like massive trauma.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the third group is where I hit this massive mental roadblock reading the sources.
Permanent cells.
Yes, the permanent cells. Because Bizzozero classified cells like neurons, skeletal muscle, and cardiac muscle as essentially retired.
Right.
And the textbooks historically argued that once these cells mature, they permanently lose the ability to divide. But wait, I have to push back here.
Okay, go ahead.
If cardiac cells can literally never divide, how does a human heart maintain its mass and function over like 80 years of constant beating without just wearing away to nothing?
What's fascinating here is that modern molecular biology actually had to fundamentally revise that permanent category for exactly that reason.
Okay, so they were wrong.
Well, yeah, and the methodology they used to prove it is genuinely mind-bending.
I love this part.
So for generations, medical students were taught that cardiac muscle was absolutely non-regenerative. But then in 2009, this research group led by Jonas Friesen at the Karolinska Institute published a landmark study. And they didn't rely on standard cell cultures.
No, they used carbon-14 dating,
Right.
which usually makes you think of like archaeologists dating dinosaur bones.
Or measuring atmospheric fallout from nuclear bombs.
Yeah.
And the nuclear fallout was actually the key here, because during all that extensive above-ground nuclear bomb testing in the mid-20th century, this massive spike of radioactive carbon-14 was released into the atmosphere.
Okay.
And that specific isotope was incorporated into plants, it moved up the food chain, and ultimately became locked into the DNA double helix of human cells whenever those cells divided.
That is wild.
It is. So by isolating human heart cells from individuals who lived through that specific era and measuring the carbon-14 trapped in their DNA, Friesen's group proved that human cardiomyocytes are not entirely static.
So they do turn over.
They do turn over.
But, I mean, the turnover is agonizingly slow, right?
Right.
Because the study noted it happens at a rate of roughly 1% per year in young adults.
Right.
And that rate only declines as you age.
Exactly. So because of that tiny, tiny margin, we had to redefine the word permanent.
Huh.
Today, it means the turnover rate is negligible, not zero. They have a microscopic capacity to divide just for baseline maintenance. But it is nowhere near robust enough to mount a response to a sudden catastrophic injury.
Okay, so moving from the microscopic capacity of these individual cells to the actual site of a wound.
Yeah.
What translates those cellular limits into a coordinated repair job? Like if I accidentally take a knife to my forearm chopping vegetables, how does the local tissue coordinate the blueprint to build a scar?
Right. So we map that blueprint using a 4-phase model of repair. And this was heavily pioneered by researchers like Russell Ross in the 1960s.
Okay.
He really shifted the focus towards specific signaling molecules. So the absolute moment you take damage, you enter phase 1, which is hemostasis.
Some emergency triage.
Exactly. Within seconds, your blood vessels constrict and platelets just flood the area.
But it's not just a passive clog, right?
No. The platelets are essentially pouring this quick-drying biological concrete into a rebar mesh made of a protein called fibrin. Yeah, it completely plugs the breach and forms a provisional scaffold for the rest of the immune system to essentially walk on.
And once that provisional scaffold is stable, we move into phase 2, which is inflammation.
Right. So neutrophils flood the site first to sterilize the area. They aggressively clear out debris and neutralize any pathogens.
But then the environment shifts pretty dramatically by day 2 or 3, right?
Yes, that's when the real directors of the repair process arrive, the macrophages.
And this was the biggest paradigm shift for me reading the sources, because I always pictured macrophages as just the cellular cleanup crew.
Right, like little Roombas.
Yeah, these blob-like entities that just show up to eat the dead tissue and the spent neutrophils like Pac-Man.
Yeah.
But they are so much more than waste management.
Oh, completely.
The macrophages basically act as the foremen of the construction site.
That's a perfect analogy. Because while they are eating the debris, phagocytosing it, they are continuously analyzing the local environment. And based on the extent of the damage they sense, they secrete these highly specific cocktails of cytokines and growth factors. Primarily platelet-derived growth factor, or PDGF, and transforming growth factor beta, or TGF-beta.
Okay, so they're sending out signals.
Exactly. By releasing these chemicals, they create a concentration gradient in the surrounding tissue. They're effectively dictating the terms of the next phase. They're sending out chemical commands that basically say, hey, we have too much structural loss here, regeneration is off the table, initiate the fibrosis program.
They make the executive call.
They really do.
And if fibrosis is chosen, that chemical gradient drags us right into phase 3, proliferation.
Right. So the macrophages call in these specialized cells called fibroblasts.
And the fibroblasts migrate up that chemical gradient, they enter the wound site, and they begin frantically synthesizing new extracellular matrix.
Yeah, they rapidly lay down massive amounts of type 3 collagen.
While at the exact same time, nearby endothelial cells break out of existing blood vessels and sprout into the wound to restore oxygen flow.
Yes, a process called angiogenesis. And the combination of those sprouting, fragile new capillaries and the fibroblasts churning out that early collagen that creates what we call granulation tissue.
Granulation tissue.
Right. If you've ever had a deep scrape and you observe that pink, slightly bumpy, granular-looking tissue at the base of the healing wound.
Yeah, you know exactly what that looks like.
Yeah, well, you are looking directly at an active proliferation phase.
The sources also highlight a really interesting subclass of cells here called myofibroblasts.
Oh, those are incredible.
Yeah, because some of those fibroblasts actually develop contractile filaments internally, kind of similar to smooth muscle cells.
Right.
And they physically anchor themselves to the edges of the wound matrix and just pull the margins of the tissue together.
It reduces the total surface area the body has to patch. It is a stunning feat of microscopic mechanical engineering.
It really is.
And finally, as the wound physically closes, you enter phase 4, remodeling.
Because that initial type 3 collagen laid down by the fibroblasts was like a hasty, disorganized patch, right?
Exactly. It was just a rush job to close the gap. So over weeks, months, or even years, the body deploys these enzymes called matrix metalloproteinases.
MMPs.
MMPs. Think of them as biological scissors. They slowly snip apart that sloppy type 3 collagen framework, allowing the body to replace it with much stronger, highly organized type E collagen.
I want to pause on a really critical realization here, though, because for a long time, the relationship between inflammation and repair was viewed as strictly sequential.
Right. You suffer inflammation, the inflammation eventually ends, and then you heal.
But contemporary pathophysiology views them as inextricably interlocked. Like, fibrosis is not merely a default failure to regenerate.
Not at all.
It is an actively regulated program driven by the macrophages based on the character, the intensity, and the duration of that inflammatory phase.
And that distinction changes everything. Because if fibrosis is a biological choice, rather than just an inevitable mechanical failure, it implies a regulated system that could, theoretically, be manipulated.
Right. So if the macrophage is making this choice based on the environment, it makes complete sense why different organs react so differently to extreme trauma.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's look at the liver, which apparently stands entirely alone in its capacity to recover.
The liver is the undisputed champion of human tissue repair.
Because liver hepatocytes are those stable cells we mentioned earlier, right?
Exactly, meaning they are normally dormant, but they retain a very robust ability to re-enter the cell cycle. Because of that, a surgeon can actually remove up to 70% of a person's liver for a living donor transplant.
70%. I mean, cutting out more than 2/3 of a solid organ sounds universally fatal.
Right, but the donor's remaining liver cells simply wake up. They undergo this process called compensatory hyperplasia.
Hyperplasia meaning the remaining cells are rapidly multiplying to compensate for the missing volume.
Yeah, exactly. Driven by growth factors, they physically rebuild the missing mass within a matter of just weeks.
It's unbelievable.
The functional mass and the specific cellular architecture are entirely restored. It is the most profound example of true regeneration in adult human biology.
But then you contrast that triumph with the human heart.
Right.
If you suffer a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, a coronary artery gets blocked, oxygen gets cut off, and a localized segment of your heart muscle dies.
Now apply Bitzo-Zero's cell rules to that scenario.
Yeah.
Cardiomyocytes are functionally permanent. There are 0 viable cells available to replicate and rebuild that dead zone.
Right.
So the macrophages arrive, they clear out the necrotic tissue, and they immediately recognize that regeneration is biologically impossible at that scale.
So they hit the panic button.
Basically, they secrete profound amounts of TGF-beta, which commands the fibroblast to initiate massive fibrosis. And over the next 6 weeks, a permanent collagenous scar replaces the dead muscle.
Which poses a really terrifying mechanical trade-off.
It does.
Because on one hand, laying down that dense collagen prevents the weakened ventricular wall from physically rupturing under the pressure of your heartbeat.
Right, it saves your life in the short term.
But scar tissue cannot contract, and more critically, it does not conduct electricity.
That is the real danger.
Yeah.
The precise electrical impulses that synchronize your heartbeat hit that dense wall of scar collagen, and they just scatter.
Wow.
This disorganized electrical feedback is exactly why post-infarction scars are a massive clinical risk factor for life-threatening arrhythmias and eventually total heart failure.
Because the fibrotic patch saves the patient in the immediate aftermath, but it creates a permanent mechanical liability.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because we assume skin always scars when it's cut deeply enough.
Right.
But there is a massive paradox in the clinical data. There is actually a specific window where human skin heals without any scarring whatsoever.
Yes.
And that window is before we are born.
If a surgical wound is made in a mammalian fetus prior to roughly the 3rd trimester, so around 24 weeks gestation in humans, it heals with absolutely perfect regeneration.
Like it never happened.
The skin regrows normal hair follicles, sebaceous glands, and an identical collagen architecture.
It's like the trauma never occurred. And the literature from researchers at UCSF in the 80s and 90s dives really deep into the why behind this.
And it all circles back to the environment the macrophage is interpreting.
Right, because fetal tissue is bathed in high levels of hyaluronic acid, and the fetal immune system is generally less active, meaning that initial inflammatory phase is heavily muted.
But the most decisive variable comes down to the specific ratio of that growth factor we mentioned earlier, TGF-beta.
Okay, break that down for us.
So transforming growth factor beta comes in several isoforms or variations. In adult wounds, macrophages pump out high levels of TGF-beta 1 and TGF-beta 2.
And those are aggressively pro-fibrotic signals.
Exactly. They scream at the fibroblasts to churn out scar tissue. But the fetal wound environment is overwhelmingly dominated by TGF-beta 3.
TGF-beta 3.
Right, which actually functions as an anti-fibrotic regulator. It suppresses all that frantic collagen production and instructs the local cells to calmly regenerate.
Okay, wait. If the only major difference between me carrying a permanent scar and a fetus perfectly regenerating its skin is the local concentration of TGF-beta 3, why aren't we just injecting that specific growth factor into adult wounds?
Well, a biotech company called Renovo asked that exact question.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, and it led to one of the most sobering cautionary tales in translational medicine.
Oh, no.
Yeah, they developed a recombinant human TGF-beta 3 drug called avotermin. And the hypothesis was elegantly simple, right? Flood the adult wound environment with TGF-beta 3, mimic the fetal environment, and shut down the scarring program.
That makes total sense on paper.
It does. And the early phase trials were phenomenal. The medical community genuinely thought we were on the verge of just curing scarring entirely.
But then what happened?
When avotermin advanced to massive phase 3 clinical trials in 2011, it failed completely.
Completely.
It could not demonstrate the significant improvement required over a simple placebo. It was a crushing blow to the field.
Wow.
It serves as this brutal reminder that a compelling mechanism that works flawlessly in isolated animal models doesn't always survive the sheer chaotic complexity of human biology in a large-scale trial.
That is wild. And, knowing that a meticulously engineered billion-dollar biologic failed, really casts a shadow on all the everyday scar prevention treatments you see at the local pharmacy.
Oh, absolutely.
The silicone sheets, the pressure garments, the onion extract gels. Like, do they actually manipulate the healing phases, or is it mostly just marketing?
It remains a heavily debated topic in dermatology. Now, silicone sheeting does have clinical backing.
Okay.
It works mechanically by hydrating the stratum corneum and providing physical tension relief, which actually downregulates fibroblast activity.
Got it.
But for many of the topical gels and creams, the clinical marketing has drastically outrun the rigorous scientific proof. You simply cannot rub an onion extract gel on an adult laceration and expect to revert the tissue to a state of fetal regeneration.
Right. But it makes you wonder, does the underlying hardware for adult regeneration even exist in mammalian DNA?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because we always look at amphibians, like salamanders, that can literally regrow an amputated limb bone by bone. Have mammals completely lost that cellular machinery over evolutionary time?
Well, an accidental discovery in the 1990s suggests we might actually still possess it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, researchers were working with a specific strain of lab mouse known as the MRL-MPJ mouse.
Okay.
And standard laboratory procedure involves punching a tiny 2-millimeter hole in a mouse's ear for identification.
Sure.
Normally, the cartilage and skin heal by forming a tiny ring of scar tissue around a permanent hole.
Right.
But researchers noticed that in this specific MRL strain, the ear holes were completely vanishing.
Wait, they were closing the gaps with true tissue regeneration.
Yes. The cartilage, the epidermis, the hair follicles, they all grew back perfectly.
That is incredible.
It really is. It implies that mammals aren't actually missing the cellular machinery to regenerate. Rather, evolutionary pressure, likely selected for rapid fibrotic scarring to prevent infection in dirty environments, and it locked the regeneration machinery behind genetic switches.
So the MRL mouse simply possesses a mutation that flips that latent switch back on.
Exactly. We might just be suppressed salamanders.
Suppressed salamanders. I love that.
It is a profoundly tantalizing theory, and it drives a massive amount of regenerative research today.
I bet.
But until we uncover how to safely manipulate that latent switch in humans, we're bound by the realities of scarring. And because fibrotic repair is just so universal, the clinical landscape is cluttered with medical myths that require some serious debunking.
All right, let's get into some of those. Because, for instance, there's this really pervasive assumption that if you just give a scar enough time, it eventually fades back to the normal mechanical strength of skin.
Which is biologically false.
Really?
Yeah. A mature scar never regains the original tensile strength of unwounded skin. It permanently plateaus at roughly 70 to 80%.
Wow, I had no idea.
The reason lies in the collagen architecture. Normal skin utilizes type I collagen, woven in this highly organized, multi-directional basket weave pattern.
Okay.
But scar tissue is densely cross-linked in a rigid parallel alignment. Furthermore, scars terminally lack epidermal appendages. That tissue will never grow hair, and it will never produce sweat indefinitely.
That's crazy. Okay, what about the misconception that once the skin is visibly closed and, the scab falls off, the healing process is finished?
Oh, that visible closure is just the beginning of phase 4.
Just the beginning.
Right. Beneath the surface, the remodeling phase continues for months, and in severe burns, well over a year. The MMPs are relentlessly degrading the provisional matrix, swapping out collagen types, and attempting to organize the localized chaos long after the wound appears externally healed.
Okay, one more. We tend to view old scars as completely inert, right? Just dead, leftover tissue.
That's a dangerous one. They are heavily cross-linked, yes, but they are not biologically inert. In rare circumstances, chronic scars, particularly from severe burns that face constant mechanical tension, they can undergo malignant transformation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the chronic friction and localized cellular dysplasia over decades can occasionally develop into a highly aggressive squamous cell carcinoma. It's a specific clinical entity known as a Marjolins ulcer.
That is terrifying.
It is. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, understanding how macrophages and fibroblasts build a scar isn't just about dermatology.
Right.
Think about what happens when this exact fibrotic program initiates deep inside a vital organ and the cellular signal to stop never arrives.
That is the terrifying bridge where tissue repair transitions into fatal chronic disease.
Exactly.
Because when we look at conditions like idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis in the lungs or cirrhosis in the liver, we are looking at wound healing that just refuses to turn off.
Right.
Cirrhosis isn't some rogue, isolated pathology. It is the exact same macrophage-driven, fibroblast-executed repair program we just walked through.
Yes. But because the liver is facing relentless, unending injury, whether from, chronic alcohol toxicity or a persistent viral hepatitis infection, the macrophages constantly perceive damage.
So they continuously flood the liver with TGF-beta.
And the fibroblasts endlessly lay down type A collagen.
And eventually, the functioning liver cells are just completely choked out by a web of non-functional scar tissue.
It's tragic, really.
So what does this all mean? Why does understanding the nuances of a cellular construction site matter to you listening right now?
Well, it matters because healing isn't merely the act of getting better.
Right. It is a delicate, high-stakes biological calculation that dictates global health outcomes. It explains the devastating amputation rates in diabetic populations.
Because chronic hyperglycemia severely disrupts the crucial handoff between the inflammation phase and the proliferation phase.
Leaving those wounds permanently stalled in a toxic, non-healing state.
Right. And it fundamentally explains why rigorous cardiac rehabilitation and continuous rhythm monitoring are non-negotiable after a heart attack. You are managing a permanent electrically dead zone in the center of a dynamic pump.
It also demystifies keloid scarring, right? This condition where the fibrotic machinery just wildly overshoots, producing these expanding masses of disorganized collagen far beyond the original wound boundary.
Exactly. It's a genetic variation of repair that disproportionately affects people with darker skin, significantly altering how routine procedures from major abdominal surgeries all the way down to simple ear piercings have to be managed.
Ultimately, flawless regeneration and fibrotic scarring are two profoundly different destinations.
But both represent an absolute miracle of cellular coordination. Your body is perpetually reading its environment, making split-second decisions to ensure you remain intact.
And realizing that conditions like cirrhosis and pulmonary fibrosis are essentially just the wound-healing machinery trapped in an endless loop, that opens up a really fascinating horizon.
It really does.
If those fatal diseases are driven by macrophages that simply won't put down the clipboard, could the future of medicine bypass the need for organ transplants entirely?
It's a huge question.
Because if we can eventually discover the precise molecular switch to command those local macrophages to just turn the fibrotic program off, we might cure organ failure before a surgeon ever needs to intervene.
That's the dream.
Just a little something to think about the next time you trace that silver line on your skin.